In the restricted medical archives of South Carolina, there is a sealed autopsy report from 1860 that details a horrifying discovery. The coroner found a 4-inch rusted iron key lodged deep within the intestines of a wealthy plantation mistress. She hadn't swallowed it by accident. She had carried it inside her living body for 8 years as a trophy. On a stifling August afternoon, this woman summoned a 14-year-old servant to her bedroom, slammed the heavy oak door, and deliberately swallowed the only way out, while the boy watched in terror. She didn't just lock the door. She turned her own flesh into the prison mechanism. To escape, the boy would have to cut her open. History books call it a nervous breakdown. But the secret journals of the family doctor reveal a calculated act of possession so disturbing that the family erased the boy's existence within 48 hours to hide it. Today, we open the file on the iron silence and the crime that was too grotesque for the law to punish. Before we pry open the rusted hinges of this case, I invite you to join our growing archive of the unseen. If you value the investigation of history's darkest corners, subscribe to Before the Story and enable notifications so you never miss a revelation. Like this video to help us bring these buried truths to the surface. And tell us in the comments, from what part of the world are you joining us to uncover this story tonight? The geographical isolation of the Bellamy rice plantation, situated on the marshy outskirts of Georgetown, South Carolina, served as both a fortress of wealth and a prison of humidity in the mid-19th century. The estate was surrounded by brackish water and ancient cypress trees draped in Spanish moss, a landscape that seemed to trap the heat and the secrets of its inhabitants in equal measure. According to the foundational medical ledger kept by Dr. Aris Thorne, the family physician, the air itself was considered a miasma capable of unbalancing the humors of those with delicate constitutions. It is in this ledger, dated between 1850 and 1852, that we find the first clinical descriptions of Caroline Bellamy, the 24-year-old daughter of the estate's patriarch, Colonel Silas Bellamy. Thorne describes her not as a monster, but as a medical curiosity, a woman whose internal world had begun to rot long before her physical decline. Caroline was known in local society for her erratic behavior, often attributed to a prolonged fever she had suffered 2 years prior, which left her prone to spells of intense melancholia followed by manic lucidity. The plantation documents reveal a woman increasingly confined to the upper floors of the main house, observing the world through the distorted glass of her bedroom window. Her father, a man concerned primarily with the yield of his rice fields and the maintenance of his reputation, viewed her condition as an inconvenient defect to be managed with laudanum and isolation. The staff, however, saw something far more unsettling in her gaze, a predation that had no specific target until the summer of 1852. The records from this period are sparse, yet they paint a picture of a household holding its breath, waiting for a storm that would not come from the clouds, but from the mistress's chamber. The atmosphere within the Bellamy household was dictated by strict, unspoken rules of segregation and invisibility, where the enslaved staff were expected to be present yet absent, tools of comfort rather than human beings. Among them was Thomas, a 14-year-old boy born on the estate, whose role was primarily that of a house servant, tasked with the quiet maintenance of the family's daily comforts. Dr. Thorne's early notes mention Thomas only in passing, describing him as having a steady hand and a temperament suited for the sick room, a compliment that would ultimately seal his fate. Unlike the other servants who learned to avoid Caroline's unpredictable temper, Thomas possessed a natural stillness that seemed to soothe her frantic energy, making him indispensable in her eyes. This reliance began innocuously, with requests for water for open windows, or for the reading of simple passages from the Bible during her headaches. The other servants, particularly the head housekeeper, Ma'am Sarah, watched these interactions with a growing sense of dread, recognizing a shift in the dynamic that the masters chose to ignore. In a society built on the absolute domination of one race over another, any deviation from the script of master and servant was dangerous, but a deviation involving emotional dependency was catastrophic. Caroline did not merely give orders. She began to seek an audience, turning the boy into a reluctant witness to her unraveling mind. The isolation of the plantation meant that these subtle transgressions went unnoticed by the outside world, festering within the walls of the manor like mold behind wallpaper. The colonel was often away in Charleston on business, leaving the governance of the house to his daughter's whims and the overseer's brutal efficiency in the fields. This power vacuum allowed Caroline's fixation to grow unchecked, nourished by the suffocating heat of a South Carolina August. The documentation from this time, receipts for medical supplies, letters of complaint about the heat, betrays a normalcy that was entirely superficial. Beneath the surface, the plantation was a powder keg, and the spark was being struck in the upstairs bedroom. Dr. Thorne's journal entries from early 1852 begin to show a change in his patient's demeanor. She was no longer complaining of physical ailments, but spoke of a hollow ache that medicine could not touch. She described her existence as a series of disappearing acts, where she felt herself fading into the heavy draperies and the polished mahogany furniture. It was a profound existential crisis, masked as hysteria, a desperate need to be anchored to reality by something or someone tangible. Her gaze, Thorne noted, had lost its frantic darting and had settled into a heavy, unblinking stare that unnerved even him. He wrote, "Her madness is not chaotic. It is narrowing. It is finding a focal point." That focal point, unbeknownst to the doctor at the time, was the boy who silently polished the silver and refilled the water pitchers, moving through the house with the caution of prey in a predator's den. Thomas's life is difficult to reconstruct from the archives, as the enslaved were rarely granted the dignity of recorded biography. But his presence is felt in the negative space of the family's documents. He exists in the margins, in the pauses of conversation, and in the growing list of duties that kept him closer to the main house and further from the safety of the quarters. His silence in the historical record is deafening, a testament to a life lived under the constant threat of erasure. The setting itself played a crucial role in the tragedy. The oppressive architecture of the plantation house, with its high ceilings and locking doors, was designed to enforce control. Every room was a potential cell, and every key a symbol of the power to grant or deny freedom, a symbolism that Caroline would soon twist into a grotesque literalism. The humidity that warped the floorboards and rusted the ironwork seemed to seep into the minds of the inhabitants, blurring the lines between authority and obsession. It was a place where the heat could drive a person to madness, and where the isolation ensured that madness would have no witnesses but the victims. As we examine the prelude to the incident, it becomes clear that the horror did not begin with the swallowing of the key, but with the gradual erosion of boundaries that preceded it. The stage was set not by a single act of violence, but by months of quiet, suffocating pressure applied to a boy who had no means of escape. The documents from 1852 are not just records of a plantation, they are the blueprints of a trap, meticulously constructed by a woman losing her grip on reality and a society that refused to stop her. The first concrete evidence that something unnatural was occurring in the Bellamy household appears not in a diary or a letter, but in a mundane household inventory list dated June 1852. Ma'am Sarah, the enslaved housekeeper whose sharp eye maintained the order of the manor, kept meticulous records of the estate's linens, silver, and ceramics. In a ledger intended to track breakage and theft, a pattern of anomalies begins to emerge that defies the logic of ordinary household management. The list details a series of missing items from the common rooms: a silver spoon, a silk cravat belonging to the colonel, a small porcelain cup, and a linen napkin. At first glance, these missing items might suggest petty theft or carelessness, offences that would typically result in severe punishment for the staff. However, a marginal note written in Mom Sarah's cramped, learned hand reveals a discovery that shifts the narrative from theft to fetishism. The items were not lost. They were found during a routine turning of the mattress in Caroline's bedroom, tucked beneath the feather ticking like a dragon's hoard. What makes this discovery chilling is not the value of the items, but their specific history. Each object had been recently cleaned, polished, or handled by Thomas. The inventory list serves as a forensic record of a fixation taking root in the physical world. Caroline was not stealing for greed, but was collecting traces of the boy's labor and presence. Mom Sarah notes that the items were arranged in a specific pattern, a circle beneath where Caroline slept, suggesting a ritualistic attempt to keep the essence of the boy close to her even in her sleep. The housekeeper's notation is clinical, but laden with unspoken fear. Found beneath Miss Caroline's bed, returned to cabinet. Boy was not told. This silence was a protective measure, an attempt to shield Thomas from the dangerous knowledge that he was being hunted. This documentation provides a glimpse into the predatory nature of Caroline's deteriorating mind. She was treating Thomas not as a servant, but as an object to be catalogued and possessed. The theft of the cravat, an item of clothing that Thomas would have ironed but never worn, indicates a desire to intrude upon his physical sphere, to touch what he had touched. It was a violation of the boundaries that defined their respective worlds, a transgression that turned the mundane duties of a house slave into a perilous intimacy. The other servants, aware of the discovery, began to alter their routines, trying to keep Thomas out of the main house. But their efforts were futile against the mistress's commands. In July, a second inventory reveals an escalation. This time, the missing items were more personal and less valuable to the estate, but infinitely more significant. A piece of driftwood Thomas had whittled, a rough cloth he used to wipe his brow, and a small tin cup he drank from in the kitchen were all recovered from Caroline's armoire. These were not objects of the house. They were objects of the boy, items that carried his scent and the evidence of his existence. The fact that Caroline had to descend to the kitchen or the servants' quarters to procure some of these items suggests she was stalking him within her own home. The growing collection of artifacts points to a psychological phenomenon known as sympathetic magic, the belief that possessing a part of a person grants power over the whole. Caroline was building a shrine to her obsession, constructing a reality where Thomas belonged to her in a way that the law could not fully encompass. The documents do not record her thoughts, but her actions scream of a desperate need to consume his identity, to merge his life with hers. Mom Sarah's records become more sporadic in July, perhaps out of fear that documenting the madness would bring it down upon them all. Yet a specific entry stands out: a broken hand mirror found in the trash, wrapped in a cloth that Mom Sarah identifies as part of Thomas's old shirt. The glass was shattered inward as if struck by a fist, but the cloth was carefully folded around the shards. This violent juxtaposition of destruction and care foreshadows the tragedy to come. Caroline wanted to break the boy's world while preserving the pieces for herself. The anomaly of the inventory list is the first ripple in the water, signaling the monster rising beneath the surface. The servants' reaction to these discoveries, as inferred from the shift in duty rosters, was a collective attempt to construct a wall of bodies between the boy and the mistress. Older women began to take over Thomas's tasks in the upper rooms, claiming he was needed for heavier labor in the yard. But these maneuvers were transparent to Caroline, who simply countermanded them with the absolute authority of her station. The inventory list documents a silent war of logistics where the enslaved staff tried to use the household's own bureaucracy to save one of their own. By August, the anomalies had ceased to be recorded in the inventory, not because they had stopped, but because they had become too dangerous to write down. The silence in the ledger from this point on is heavy with implication. The situation had moved beyond the theft of spoons and napkins into a realm that defied categorization. The collection was no longer enough. The predator was finished with the traces and was now ready for the source. The first documented anomaly concludes with the realization that the mistress was not just observing Thomas, she was preparing a space for him. The private correspondence of Colonel Silas Bellamy, preserved in the family's business archives, offers a perspective of the tragedy from the height of patriarchal ignorance. Writing to a business associate in Charleston during the summer of 1852, the colonel complains extensively of domestic disturbances that he views as mere annoyances rather than warning signs. In a letter dated late July, he expresses frustration with his daughter's refusal to allow female maids to attend to her personal needs, a breach of propriety that baffled him. "She has dismissed 3 girls this week for clumsiness," he writes, and insists that only the boy with the quiet hands is capable of bringing her tea without spilling it. This specific demand for Thomas violated the strict gender and social segregation of the time, where personal attendance in a lady's bedchamber was the exclusive domain of female servants. The colonel's acquiescence to this demand, framed as a concession to a sick woman's whims, marks a critical failure of authority. He viewed Thomas as a piece of furniture, a neutral entity without gender or agency, and thus saw no danger in the arrangement. "Let her have him for the afternoons," he instructs the overseer in a separate note, "if it keeps her from screaming and disturbing my accounts." These letters reveal how the accumulation of Thomas's presence in the upper quarters was sanctioned by the very authority meant to maintain order. The colonel's writings document a man so focused on profit and public appearance that he was blind to the grotesque intimacy developing under his roof. He describes Caroline's spells as becoming less frequent when the boy is present, mistaking her predatory calm for recovery. This misinterpretation allowed the obsession to metastasize, protected by the father's desire for a quiet house. Meanwhile, scattered notes from the overseer to the colonel hint at the disruption this favoritism was causing among the staff. "The other Negroes are unsettled," the overseer scrawls in a semi-literate report. "They claim the boy is being kept past dusk. It breeds disorder." The overseer's concern was not for Thomas's safety, but for the discipline of the workforce, fearing that special treatment would lead to rebellion. This tension illustrates the complex web of power dynamics. Thomas was being isolated from his community by the very favor that entrapped him. Another piece of evidence comes from a bill of sale for a new lock on the bedroom door, dated early August. The receipt, found among the household expenses, includes a note for heavy iron mechanism, custom fitting. While locking doors was standard, the specification for a heavy iron mechanism for an interior room is an anomaly that suggests a desire for a prison-grade barrier. Caroline was fortifying her sanctuary, preparing the physical space for a confinement that would soon become all too real. The accumulation of evidence also includes a series of rejected dinner invitations, where Caroline refused to leave her room or receive guests unless Thomas was serving. This social withdrawal was the final step in creating a hermetic world where only she and the boy existed. The letters from confused neighbors asking after her health went unanswered or were met with curt replies penned by the colonel. The house was closing in on itself, the windows shuttered against the intrusion of the outside world. Thomas's presence in the upper rooms became a spectre haunting the documentation of the household's daily life. Work logs show his hours in the field or kitchen dropping to zero, while his attendance hours skyrocketed. He was effectively being removed from the general population of the estate, sequestered in the twilight of the mistress's chamber. The silence of his own voice in these records is replaced by the sheer weight of his time being consumed by her. The most disturbing piece of accumulated evidence is a sketchbook found years later, belonging to Caroline. Though she was an indifferent artist, the pages from that summer are filled with repetitive charcoal sketches of a pair of hands. Thomas's hands. They are drawn holding a cup, opening a curtain, resting on a table. The obsession with his hands, the instruments of his service, underscores her fixation on his utility and his physical reality. The sketches are frantic, dark and heavy, the charcoal pressed so hard it tore the paper. As the weeks progressed, the Colonel's letters shift from annoyance to a vague unease, noting that Caroline had begun to speak of the boy as if he were an extension of her own will. She claims he understands her thoughts before she speaks them, he writes, dismissing it as women's fancy. But to the modern observer, this statement is a chilling indicator of the psychological consumption taking place. The accumulation of these anomalies, the letters, the lock, the sketches, points to a predator who had ceased to see her prey as a separate being. Dr. Aris Thorne's private journal, distinct from the official medical ledger, offers the first intellectual attempt to categorize the horror unfolding at Bellamy Plantation. Unlike the Colonel, Thorne was a man of science who observed the nuances of human behavior with a clinical, if detached, eye. In an entry dated August 2, 1852, he moves beyond the diagnosis of hysteria to formulate a hypothesis that is both astute and horrifying. He observes a shift in Caroline's condition. She is no longer frantic, she is dangerously calm, a state he attributes to what he terms a transference of will. Thorne writes, she looks at him not as a servant, but as an anchor, and an anchor must be drowned to function. This metaphor reveals Thorne's understanding that Caroline's stability was being purchased at the cost of Thomas's autonomy. He hypothesizes that Caroline, feeling her own identity fragmenting under the weight of her illness and isolation, sought to graft herself onto someone she perceived as solid and unchanging. Thomas, with his forced silence and stillness, became the perfect vessel for this parasitic projection. The doctor notes that during his visits, Caroline would not answer his questions directly, but would instead look at Thomas, waiting for him to nod or move before she would speak. Thorne posits that she believed she was drawing vitality from him, a psychic vampirism where his presence was the only thing keeping her tethered to the earth. She inhales when he enters, Thorne records, and exhales only when he is within reach. This hypothesis of a parasitic obsession reframes the narrative from a romance or a friendship into a tale of survival, hers at the expense of his. Thorne also speculates on the power dynamics at play, noting that Caroline's delusion was fueled by the absolute authority she wielded. In her mind, ownership had transcended the legal definition. She believed she owned his time, his breath, and his very existence. Thorne describes this as a fusion of the despot and the dependent, a dangerous combination where the oppressor is terrifyingly needy. He realized that if Thomas were to be removed, the collapse of her psyche would be total and violent. The journal details a specific incident where Thorne attempted to dismiss Thomas from the room to examine Caroline privately. Caroline's reaction was immediate and visceral. She did not scream, but she gripped the arm of her chair until her nails bled, her eyes rolling back as if she were suffocating. Thorne was forced to recall the boy, noting that as soon as Thomas returned, the color flushed back into her cheeks. It is a physiological dependency, he writes, as real as that of an infant to a mother. but inverted and perverse. Thorne's hypothesis extends to Thomas's state as well, though he views the boy with a pity that borders on scientific curiosity. He notes Thomas's trembling hands and the sweat on his brow, interpreting them not just as fear, but as the physical toll of carrying another person's sanity. The boy is withering, Thorne observes. He is being hollowed out by her need. This recognition of the physical impact on the victim distinguishes Thorne's private thoughts from the public indifference. The doctor wrestles with the ethical implications of his hypothesis, but ultimately chooses observation over intervention. He rationalizes his inaction by claiming that disturbing the delicate balance could lead to a nervous catastrophe for his patient. This failure to act, justified by medical caution, makes Thorne complicit in the entrapment. He saw the trap closing, named it, and then watched it happen. Thorne concludes his entry with a chilling prediction that this transference cannot be sustained indefinitely. He compares it to a sealed vessel under pressure, noting that eventually the boundary between the two must shatter. She will seek to make the connection permanent, he theorizes, for fear is a terrible architect. This first hypothesis from the sources provides the psychological framework for the tragedy. It strips away the veneer of madness and reveals the cold logic of obsession. Caroline Bellamy did not just want a servant, she wanted a human shield against the void, and she was willing to forge that shield out of flesh and bone. Thorne's journal stands as a testament to the fact that the horror was seen, understood, and allowed to proceed. The insular world of the plantation was breached in early August by a dinner party, an event intended to signal Caroline's return to health, but which instead documented the utter collapse of social norms. A letter from a visiting cousin, Elizabeth Manigault, sent to her mother in Charleston, provides a vivid, scandalized account of the evening. Elizabeth describes the atmosphere as brittle, with Caroline seated at the head of the table, dressed in finery that hung loosely on her gaunt frame, her eyes fixed on the door to the pantry. When Thomas entered to pour the wine, the event that shattered the evening occurred. Elizabeth writes, "As the boy reached across to fill her glass, Caroline did not lift her cup. Instead, she reached out with a hand like a claw and gripped his wrist. The silence that fell over the table was absolute. In the rigid hierarchy of the South, physical contact between a white mistress and an enslaved male was the ultimate taboo, a transgression that carried heavy moral and social implications. But Elizabeth notes that the grip was not affectionate. It was desperate, like a drowning man clutching a piece of driftwood. Caroline refused to let go for a full minute, her knuckles white, while Thomas stood frozen, the wine bottle trembling in his other hand. The guests looked to the colonel, who turned a deep shade of crimson, but remained paralyzed, unable to reprimand his daughter without acknowledging the grotesquerie of the scene. Elizabeth's letter captures the visceral horror of the guests, not at the abuse of power, of which they were all guilty, but at the intimacy of the violation. It was as if she were trying to take his pulse and put it into her own veins, she concludes. The aftermath of the dinner was immediate. The guests departed early, offering mumbled excuses about the heat and the lateness of the hour. The social fracture was complete. The Bellamy family had been exposed as unable to control their own household. Rumors began to circulate in Georgetown, not of cruelty, which was commonplace, but of unnatural affections and madness. The cousin's letter reveals the community's reaction, a closing of ranks and a distancing from the contaminated family. This public display forced the colonel into a corner. He could no longer pretend that Caroline's behavior was a private eccentricity. The letter details his shouting match with the overseer later that night, overheard through the thin walls of the guest room. He blamed the boy, of course, threatening to have him whipped for insolence, a projection of his own failure to manage his daughter. The social fracture thus endangered Thomas further, making him the scapegoat for the mistress's transgression. The letter also records the reaction of the other servants, who moved with eyes on the floor, terrified that the wrath of the embarrassed master would fall on them. Maum Sarah is described as weeping silently in the kitchen, knowing that the breach of social order usually ended in blood. The dinner party acted as a catalyst, accelerating the timeline of the tragedy by threatening the one thing the colonel valued more than his daughter, his reputation. Elizabeth's account includes a terrifying detail about Caroline's demeanor after the guests left. She was found humming in the parlor, seemingly unaware of the disaster she had orchestrated. She looked, Elizabeth writes, as if she had just eaten a full meal after starving for weeks. The public claiming of Thomas was a declaration of ownership that transcended the social contract. She was asserting her right to him before God and society. The document serves as a record of the external pressure mounting on the household. The social fracture meant that the colonel would soon act to remove the problem, a threat that Caroline likely sensed. Her desperation to secure Thomas was no longer just about her mental state. It was a race against her father's impending intervention. The dinner party proved that the status quo was unsustainable. The record of this fracture ends with Elizabeth's decision to leave the next morning, fleeing the oppressive air of the house. Her departure signaled the final isolation of the plantation. There would be no more witnesses from the outside world. The stage was cleared for the final act, leaving only the family, the doctor, and the victim trapped in the stifling heat of the impending crisis. The tension that had been building for months finally snapped on August 14th, 1852, a date marked in the plantation's records by a frantic scribbled note from the overseer sent via messenger to Dr. Thorne. This document, preserved in the doctor's case files, is the incident report, a piece of irrefutable evidence that captures the moment the threshold was crossed. The note is brief, written in panic. "Come at once. She has locked the door. The boy is inside. She says she has swallowed the iron." The events of that afternoon, reconstructed from this note and later testimonies, reveal a calculated escalation of Caroline's madness. Around 2 p.m. during the hottest part of the day when the house was silent, Caroline summoned Thomas to her bedroom under the pretense of needing help with a stuck window sash. As soon as he crossed the threshold, the heavy oak door was slammed shut. The servants in the hall heard the distinct, heavy click of the new iron mechanism locking into place. What followed was not the screaming of a struggle, but a terrifying silence, broken only by Caroline's voice speaking through the wood. Maum Sarah, whose testimony was recorded days later by the family lawyer in an attempt to prepare a legal defense, stated that Caroline yelled, "It is done! The iron is inside me. No one enters, no one leaves." This declaration confirms the physical reality of the horror. The key to the door was no longer in her hand or in a pocket. It was inside her body. The impact of this act was immediate and paralyzing. The swallowing of the key was a profound symbolic and physical seal. By placing the mechanism of release within her own visceral cavity, Caroline had fused her body with the prison she had created. She had made herself the living lock. To open the door, one would have to cut her open, a gruesome logic that defied immediate solution. The servants, gathered in the hallway, were rendered helpless by the sheer insanity of the barrier. Thomas's reaction, heard through the thick door, was a sound that haunted the witnesses for years. He did not scream for help. He pleaded with her, his voice low and trembling, begging her to, "Please, Miss Caroline, open it." The terror in his voice came from the realization that he was trapped in a small room with a person who had severed all ties with reason. The irrefutable evidence of his entrapment lies in the helplessness of those outside, who could only listen as the boy realized his cage was sealed by flesh and blood. The overseer's note to Thorne conveys the chaos that erupted downstairs. The colonel was summoned from the fields, arriving to find his authority completely nullified. The master of the estate, who owned the land, the house, and the people in it, was defeated by a simple mechanical fact. He could not enter the room without destroying it. The swallowing of the key was a coup, a seizure of absolute power by the daughter over the father, using the slave as the hostage. Dr. Thorne arrived within the hour, but his medical skills were useless against a locked door. His notes from that day described the surreal scene: the patriarch pounding on the wood, the doctor standing with his bag, and the silence from within that had returned after the initial declaration. Thorne realized then that his hypothesis had come true. The transference was complete. She had swallowed the way out, ensuring that for as long as the key remained in her, the boy remained with her. The documented impact of this event extends to the breakdown of the plantation's hierarchy. The field hands stopped working, gathering near the house as the news spread. The illusion of order was shattered. The incident of the key was not just a family crisis, it was a rupture in the reality of the estate. The irrefutable evidence of the key's location inside the mistress transformed the bedroom into a distinct, horrific universe separate from the rest of the world. This block concludes with the terrifying realization that time was now the enemy. Every minute the door remained locked was a minute Thomas spent in the unmediated presence of a predator who had effectively eaten his freedom. The key was the most irrefutable evidence of all, a cold, hard object sitting in a human stomach, anchoring the horror in the physical world. The period following the locking of the door is known in the fragmented records as the Hour of Silence, though it likely lasted closer to 90 minutes. It represents the total collapse of authority within the Bellamy household. The colonel, a man accustomed to instant obedience, found himself reduced to a frantic spectator in his own hallway. His shouts of command, ordering Caroline to open the door, threatening to break it down, were met with no response from the other side. The silence was a weapon, a demonstration that his power did not extend beyond the threshold. The servant's testimony describes the scene with a mix of fear and awe. The patriarch's composure disintegrated. He began to kick the door, his boots scarring the polished wood, while the staff watched, paralyzed. This loss of control was documented in the way the colonel turned his rage on the inanimate object, cursing the carpenter who had installed the lock he had paid for. The irony was absolute. The mechanisms of control he had funded were now being used to defy him. Inside the room, the silence was occasionally broken by sounds that were harder to bear than screaming. A rhythmic, low weeping that Mom Sarah identified as Thomas, and the soft, murmuring voice of Caroline, soothing him as one would a frightened pet. This auditory evidence suggests a terrifying intimacy. She was not hurting him physically, she was holding him captive in a warped embrace. The authority of the father was replaced by the tyranny of the daughter's delusion. The decision to breach the door was not made lightly. It was an admission of defeat. The colonel ordered the overseer to fetch a crowbar from the tool shed, a crude instrument of violence to solve a delicate domestic horror. The time it took to retrieve the tool was an eternity of waiting, during which the doctor attempted to negotiate through the keyhole. Thorne's pleading, appealing to Caroline's health, to the danger of the iron in her stomach, was futile. He recorded her only response: "We are safe now." When the crowbar was finally brought to the upper landing, the physical destruction of the house began. The sound of wood splintering and iron groaning echoed through the manor, a violent, intrusive act that mirrored the psychological violation taking place inside. The colonel himself wielded the bar, sweating and cursing, stripping away the veneer of the southern gentleman to reveal the brute force that underpinned his world. As the wood gave way, the collapse of authority was physicalized. The doorframe shattered and the heavy door swung open, hanging on one hinge. The sight that greeted them was not a scene of carnage, but of stillness. Caroline sat in her armchair by the window, composed, hands folded in her lap. Thomas was kneeling beside her, his head bowed, his entire body trembling so violently that he appeared to be vibrating. He was physically unharmed, but spiritually dismantled. The colonel's first action was not to check on his daughter, but to grab Thomas by the collar and drag him from the room. The boy offered no resistance. He was limp, a marionette whose strings had been cut. This act of aggression against the victim, rather than the perpetrator, reinforced the twisted logic of the plantation. The slave was the cause of the disorder, regardless of his passivity. The authority figures immediately moved to re-establish control by punishing the powerless. "Doctor." Thorne rushed to Caroline, who looked at him with a serene smile. She did not resist his examination, but when he asked about the key, she simply touched her stomach and whispered, "It is mine." The authority of medicine was baffled, the patient was calm, the foreign body was contained, and the crisis of the locked door was over, yet the horror remained. The key was not retrieved. The collapse of authority concludes with the dispersal of the witnesses. The servants were ordered back to their quarters with threats of violence if they spoke of what they had seen. The colonel attempted to plaster over the cracks in his reality, but the shattered door remained a testament to the fact that for 1 hour the plantation had belonged to the madness of a young woman and the terror of a boy. The breach was open, and the silence had escaped into the walls. For decades, the official narrative of the Bellamy family maintained that Caroline had suffered a nervous collapse and that Thomas had been sent away for his own good. However, a hidden source discovered nearly 70 years later challenges this sanitized version of events. During a renovation of the manor in the 1920s, long after the Bellamys had died out and the house had fallen into disrepair, a carpenter found a scrap of parchment slipped behind the baseboard of the bedroom near where the armchair had sat. The parchment, yellowed and brittle with age, is written in Caroline's hand. It is dated August 14th, 1852, the very day of the incident. It appears she wrote it in the moments before summoning Thomas, a final testament to her intent. The text is not a love letter, nor is it a chaotic scrawl of madness. It is a contract written with chilling, lucid precision. It reads, "I have swallowed the way out. Now we are the same. We are both trapped. He by the law, I by the iron. God will not separate what the belly has joined." This hidden source reveals the true motivation behind the swallowing of the key. It was not merely a means to lock the door, it was a philosophical act. Caroline, in her delusion, recognized the absolute lack of freedom that defined Thomas's life and sought to simulate it. She believed that by trapping herself physically, she was entering into his world of confinement. It was a grotesque attempt at empathy, a desire to align their fates so completely that they became indistinguishable. The contract exposes the depths of her existential crisis. She did not want to own him in the way her father did. She wanted to be him, or at least to share the same cage. The hidden source recontextualizes the horror. It was not just about control, but about a terrifying desire for equality in suffering. She made herself a prisoner to be close to the prisoner. The discovery of this note also explains her calm demeanor when the door was breached. In her mind, the ritual had succeeded. The door being opened by force did not matter. The key, the symbol of the pact, was still inside her. The way out was gone. She had achieved the permanent connection she sought, a secret union sealed in iron and acid. The document also sheds light on Thomas's terror. If Caroline spoke these words to him, or if he understood her intent, he would have realized he was not dealing with a master who wanted labor, but with a soul that wanted to merge. The parchment is a record of a psychological annexation. It implies that the silence in the room was filled with her explaining this pact to him, forcing him to witness the logic of his own entrapment. The location of the note, behind the baseboard, suggests it was hidden deliberately, a secret message for a future that Caroline believed she was creating. It was a time capsule of her madness, waiting to be found when the walls finally came down. The writing is steady, lacking the tremors seen in her earlier sketches, indicating a moment of absolute, terrifying clarity. This hidden source serves as the voice of the perpetrator, speaking from beyond the grave to correct the historical record. It confirms that the horror was premeditated, a ritual designed to defy the transient nature of human relationships. She wanted something eternal, and she chose iron to ensure it. The discovery forces a re-evaluation of the entire event. It was not a medical episode, but a metaphysical working. The hidden source is the final piece of the puzzle that explains why the atmosphere in that room felt so heavy. It was the weight of a soul trying to anchor itself to another, using the laws of physics and the durability of metal. The aftermath of the incident is documented in a cold, bureaucratic record that reveals the brutal efficiency of the plantation system when its order is threatened. The document is a bill of sale dated August 16th, 1852, just 48 hours after the door was opened. It is signed by Colonel Silas Bellamy and addressed to a merchant known for transporting difficult stock to the labor camps of Mississippi and Louisiana. The decision for decisive action was immediate. The colonel's justification, scribbled in a cover letter to the trader, is devoid of emotion or morality. He writes, "The boy is docile, but he has been spoiled by proximity to illness. He has become a focal point for disorder. Take him west. Do not record his name in the local ledgers. He is to be sold as field hand, no history." This document reveals the colonel's logic. Thomas was not a victim to be comforted, but a liability to be liquidated. The crime Thomas had committed was simply being the object of the mistress's obsession. In the eyes of the master, the boy was a broken tool, contaminated by the scandal. To keep him on the estate was to invite further madness from Caroline and further judgment from the community. The solution was erasure. The speed of the transaction, 48 hours, was calculated to prevent any interference or gossip. Thomas was likely held in the root cellar or a locked barn during those 2 days, isolated from the other servants to prevent him from telling his story. The bill of sale is a death warrant for his identity. By stripping him of his name and history, the colonel ensured that Thomas would vanish into the vast, anonymous machinery of the Deep South's cotton empire. The phrase, "spoiled by proximity to illness," is a chilling euphemism. It places the blame on the contagion of Caroline's madness, treating Thomas as if he were infected. The decision was not about punishment, but about sanitation. The colonel was cutting out a cancer to save the body of the estate. Dr. Thorne's role in this decision is hinted at in a separate note where he advises the colonel that recovery is impossible, while the object of fixation remains within the patient's sphere. The doctor sanctioned the removal, validating the colonel's cruelty with medical necessity. The decision was a conspiracy of the powerful to protect the perpetrator by sacrificing the witness. The bill of sale also includes a horrifying detail: the price. Thomas was sold for a sum significantly below market value, indicating a desire for a quick sale rather than a profitable one. He was discarded. The document records the reduction of a human life to a ledger entry, a final indignity in a life defined by lack of agency. The narrative of this block focuses on the mechanical nature of the removal. There were no goodbyes, no time to pack a bag. Thomas was simply extracted from his home and sent into the void. The decisive action was the final closing of the door, a lock far more permanent than the one Caroline had engaged. The justification in the source highlights the moral vacuum of the era, the preservation of the family name and the stability of the plantation outweighed any consideration of justice. The Colonel's pen stroke on that bill of sale did more damage than the crowbar. It severed Thomas from his past, his people, and his story, leaving him to drift into the oblivion of history. The final and perhaps most disturbing primary source in this case file is Dr. Aris Thorne's private autopsy note for Caroline Bellamy, dated October 1860, 8 years after the incident. Caroline died at the age of 32, officially of obstruction of the bowel and general decline. However, Thorne's private examination reveals the grisly truth that the family sought to bury along with her. Thorne records that during the post-mortem examination, he discovered a hard, encapsulated mass in the lower intestine, lodged near the ileocecal valve. Upon incision, the mass was revealed to be a rusted, partially corroded iron key. The text is clinical but laden with horror. The object has been encased in fibrous tissue. The body has formed a cyst around the iron, integrating it into the viscera. It was not passed. She carried it to the term of her life. This finding confirms that the key was never retrieved. For 8 years, Caroline Bellamy lived with the physical manifestation of her obsession inside her. The interpretation of this source suggests that the key became a part of her anatomy, a constant internal reminder of the pact she believed she had made. The pain it must have caused, the obstruction and decline, was a slow, agonizing self-destruction that she endured in silence. Thorne notes that he chose not to remove the object for the undertaker. He writes, "I have sewn the incision. She carried her secrets to the grave, iron and all. It is not my place to unlock her now." This decision to leave the key inside her is a final act of complicity. Thorne ensured that the evidence of the 1852 incident would be buried in the family plot, hidden within the rotting corpse of the perpetrator. The autopsy note also serves as a symbolic conclusion to the transference of will. The key, which represented her control over Thomas, ultimately consumed her. The mechanism of imprisonment became the agent of death. Caroline was killed by her own desire to lock the door. The irony is stark. She wanted to be anchored, and the iron anchored her to a slow, painful death. Thorne's reflection in the note reveals a man haunted by the case. He questions whether the obstruction was merely physical or if it was the weight of the unresolved sin that stopped her heart. He describes her face in death as triumphant, a detail that suggests she believed she had won. She had kept the key. She had kept the secret. The final source interprets the key as a cursed artifact. It defied the body's natural rejection of foreign objects, staying lodged for nearly a decade. It suggests a supernatural tenacity to her madness, a will so strong it forced her body to accommodate the iron. This block emphasizes the physical horror of the key's journey. It was swallowed in a moment of passion and carried for years of isolation. It became a relic of the trauma, hidden in the most intimate place possible. Thorne's final words in the ledger close the medical case, but open the moral one. The iron silence is complete. The earth will digest what the body could not. The final primary source stands as the autopsy of a crime that was never prosecuted, a verdict delivered by biology rather than a judge. The consequences of the iron silence rippled through the plantation long after Thomas was sold and Caroline was buried. The room where the incident occurred was boarded up from the outside on the Colonel's orders, the shattered door replaced by pine planks nailed across the frame. It remained sealed for the duration of the Bellamy family's tenure on the estate. Plantation records from 1853 to 1860 show a gap in the maintenance logs for the Upper West Wing. No servants were assigned to clean there, and no repairs were made. The legacy of the incident took root in the oral history of the enslaved community. Though Thomas was gone, his presence lingered in the folklore of the quarters. Ma'am Sarah's descendants told stories of the boy in the wall, a cautionary tale used to warn young men to make themselves invisible to the masters. The legend claimed that if you put your ear to the boarded planks, you could hear the sound of shallow, terrified breathing, the ghost of Thomas's fear, trapped in the room even though his body was miles away. The physical decay of the house seemed to radiate from that sealed room. Letters from the 1870s, written by distant relatives who inherited the property, complain of a dampness and a metallic smell in the upstairs hallway that no amount of scrubbing could remove. The house was unable to digest the memory of what happened, just as Caroline had been unable to digest the key. The social consequence was the slow extinction of the Bellamy line in Georgetown. The scandal, though hushed up, left a stain. The colonel died of a stroke in 1863, alone in a house that frightened him. The plantation fell into ruin after the Civil War, the fields reclaiming the rice paddies, the swamp taking back the land. The isolation that had allowed the horror to flourish ultimately doomed the estate to obscurity. Thomas's legacy is harder to trace in documents, but his erasure was the ultimate consequence. He became a field hand, no history, a ghost in the machine of slavery. The tragedy is that his survival came at the cost of his identity. He was forced to become someone else to endure the labor camps of the West, his past as a house servant in Georgetown, a dangerous memory to be suppressed. The boarded room was finally opened in the 1920s renovation that found the parchment note. The workers reported finding the room exactly as it had been left in 1852. The chair by the window, the dust thick on the floor, and scratches on the inside of the doorframe. Marks made not by fingernails, but by something sharp, perhaps a piece of the broken mirror, counting the days or hours. The legacy of the case is the silence itself. It represents the thousands of stories buried in the archives of the South, stories of obsession and power that were scrubbed from the ledgers. The iron silence is not just about a key, it is about the machinery of forgetting. The consequences serve as a grim reminder that the powerful were never punished for the harm they caused. Caroline died with her secret. The colonel died with his reputation intact. Only the enslaved paid the price. Thomas paid with his life's trajectory, and the other servants paid with the burden of the memory. Decades after the estate was dismantled, a single grainy photograph surfaced in a collection of WPA interviews with former slaves in Mississippi. The photo, dated roughly 1858, shows a chain gang working on a levee. In the background, out of focus, stands a man who bears a striking resemblance to the descriptions of Thomas. The same slight build, the same quiet stillness. He's looking directly at the camera, his face scarred and hardened, stripped of the softness of the boy who polished silver. This image, though unverified, offers a haunting coda to the case. It suggests that Thomas survived the decisive action of the colonel. He survived the erasure, but the man in the photo is not the boy who was locked in the room. That boy died in 1852, consumed by the obsession of his mistress. The man who survived is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit under crushing weight, a figure who walked out of the fire of the Bellamy plantation and into the hell of the levee, refusing to be extinguished. The historian's analysis of Case File 1852 reveals a tragedy of consumption. Caroline Bellamy consumed herself in her attempt to consume another. Her victory was Pyrrhic. She died with a rusted piece of iron as her only companion. Thomas, though displaced and scarred, remained a separate entity, a soul she could not digest. The key, in the end, locked nothing but her own fate. The Bellamy door itself, or what remains of it, resides in a small local history museum in Georgetown, often overlooked by tourists. If one looks closely at the rusted keyhole plate, one can see scratches on the metal. But these scratches are on the inside of the lock mechanism, marks that could only have been made by the key turning from within, or perhaps by the frantic desire of the iron to escape the body that held it. The story leaves us with an open question that echoes through the archives. What other silences are hiding in the ledgers of the past? How many other keys are buried in the graves of the powerful, locking away crimes that history has chosen to forget? The iron silence is broken today, but the echo of the boys breathing behind the wall remains, a sound that no amount of renovation can silence. Caroline Bellamy believed she could swallow the truth. But history has a way of cutting open the past and revealing the iron that lies in its gut. The key is found, the door is open, and the silence is finally speaking. The archives are full of locked doors, and we have only just begun to find the keys. If this story unlocked a fear you didn't know you had, you are one of us. Subscribe to Before the Story right now. Don't just watch, bear witness. Click the bell so the next secret doesn't remain buried. And before you go, look at the screen. We've selected another case file just for you. Click it. The darkness is waiting.